Welcome everybody to a new edition of What's Next, the podcast produced by Energynomics. My name is Gabriel Avakarițin and I'll be talking with Kristian Ruby, Secretary General with Euroelectric. Hi Kristian, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Thank you for joining me in this conversation and for being ready to share some thoughts for the Romanian audience that Energynomics can gather around its channels. This What's Next podcast is meant to showcase, to present the main ideas that are important for the energy industry in Romania. And with you here, we will focus more on the European level and some lessons that we might learn from Europe. So before jumping into the topics, I would like to give you the opportunity to share a few thoughts about yourself and your professional background. How comes that you are such an important figure in the energy sector? Were you interested in energy from the very beginning? I don't know.
It's a good question because if you'd asked me at the beginning of my career, would I end up here? I would have no clue that this would be where I would land. And it's not where I started out my path, I would say. So very quick roll through my career. I started out dreaming about becoming a journalist in my early life, and I actually managed to sort of kick in the door to the national Danish radio at an early age, and really enjoyed doing journalism. And after a few years, I also thought, well, I want to work with something more long-term. And at that time, I had really sort of picked up an interest and a concern over climate. So I came into the ministries in Denmark, first the environment ministry and then the climate ministry, to try to help, and eventually came to the European Commission. And that's where, by dealing with the climate cause, I saw, wow, energy is really where you need to solve something. And then after having been in public service, I thought it'd be really interesting to be in the private sector or organizations of the private sector to see how can you help transform the mindset there, and how can you actually make the change happen on the ground.
A little bit similar with my own professional career. So no formal technical background for you. Is that a problem? Have you felt that it's something that...
It's a problem and an opportunity, in the sense that what I do on a daily basis is really an act of translation between the technical people and the politicians. So what I often see is that when very technically knowledgeable people come to the politicians, they start the conversation somewhere where the politician won't understand what's going on. They will come with very technical terms, and they will sometimes act almost offended if the politician doesn't understand where they're coming from, whether it's about voltage and frequency, or whether it's about specifics around hedging or market arrangements. So really sort of being that kind of journalistic mindset and someone coming with the layman's perspective, I find useful in this particular role. But I always try to pick up more knowledge about the technical stuff, because I really think it's interesting, and at the end of the day, that is what needs to guide the policy. So that's how I sort of use my background and lack of technical background.
For many years already, we are in the middle of a huge transformation in Europe in terms of energy industry. In Romania, we're talking about the second electrification of the country. I suppose this is also the case for Europe, and in fact for the whole world. Is this a more challenging time for you compared with, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years ago?
Definitely, I think that the complexity has risen immensely. If we go by like 5 years, 7 years, we were thinking of the green transition in itself as pretty darn challenging. Wow, this was a big deal. We needed to electrify and all. And now we're looking at that same challenge, but on a completely different backdrop, where things have gotten immensely more complex and difficult, frankly. We have extreme weather now really sort of unfolding on, if not a daily basis, then a weekly basis. We have sabotage on the grid, we have cyber attacks, we have a much more fragile geopolitical situation, and we have a fragmentation of the rule-based global order, which also means that increasingly supply chains are being politicized, and we need to sort of, let's say, stay the course in the midst of all this and try to find out how do we actually get things done. The good news here is that, as it were, electrification of the economy actually is, at least in part, the solution to many of these challenges. Whether it's about the clean piece, about cleaning up our energy system, electrification is the way forward. Whether it's about energy independence, there's really a significant piece that is also about electrification. And also when it comes to affordability, at least eventually we'll also see this become, let's say, something that electricity can help solve.
One more question in this soft area, let's say, although you already presented very, very tough concepts. In Romania, there is a huge problem in the industry in attracting new people into the industry. So teenagers are not really interested in making their professional background into the energy per se. Is that a problem also in Europe? Is there any kind of solution or the advice that you might give to those in position to attract young people, or even to the young people themselves?
Well, I'd say that in general, we are facing some very big demographic challenges in society. There's going to be fewer of us, and a lot of us are going to get older. So the young people are going to take care, in quotation marks, of more old people going forward. So a lot of sectors will struggle with attracting the necessary talent and the necessary amount of people. And I think there's no silver bullet here. There's a piece that's going to go to automation. There's a piece that's going to be about actually bringing home just how important what we do is, and there's also a piece which is about directing our education system into what we actually need. Are we offering the right, let's say, portfolio of educations to young people, or are we actually misdirecting them with some offers that is eventually going to end up in a dead end? And then I would say to the young people, well, I mean, for me, there's no doubt that this is the most interesting sector. And you know, if it's about, do I go into tech or do I go into electricity, it doesn't need to be an either or anymore. Increasingly, we're seeing that the cutting edge of tech relies directly on electricity.
And
Tokens
electricity
and kilowatt hours
very much
so
depends on
closely
tech,
interlinked that you really sort of have an opportunity if you start digging into that space. And we see increasingly companies like Google looking for electrical engineers because they need them for the data centers, they need them for understanding how to source clean energy, and so on and so forth.
In Romania, the companies, especially in the government, in part focused on presenting clear path career for young people and stressed the idea of good, solid revenues for the future. I think that we should also focus more on presenting this industry as being a cool one, industry to attract smart guys and bright ones. Let's see. Let's move to Euroelectric a little bit and tell us a few words about your role, your position within this organization.
Yeah, so I'm the Secretary General, and that means that I like to think of myself as the general, and my boss, the president of the board, likes to think of me as the secretary, and we need to sort of balance those two roles. Specifically, that means that I lead and represent the organization on a daily basis. I report to the board of directors, and each of the member organizations has a representative in my board. I prepare the works for them to set the strategic direction, and then I go and implement together with my people.
We have a recent change of the board in Euroelectric. Tell us a few words about this. What does it mean? Will it change a little bit the focus and the direction?
Yeah, so every 2 years we have a new presidency team coming in. This time round it is Finland who takes over the presidency. It's Markus Rauramo, who is the CEO of Fortum. And he is then flanked by Georgios Stasis, who's also active here in Romania from PPC, and by Catherine McGregor from Engie. And together they are sort of setting out the direction for the next 3 years, and we're going to have 3 specific focus points. One is going to be about electrification and being close to the customers, especially the industrial ones. The second one is about continuing our work on energy security, and the third one is going to be about exploring further the opportunities, but also the threats of digitalization and in particular AI, how that's going to transform the sector in the next few years.
In Romania, there are many understandings on the formula energy transition, and I think that there are good reasons for that, because we are in the middle of a huge transformation. For example, getting rid of the gas from Russia is a form of energy transition. In case of Germany, it's evident this, but there are also others. This decentralization of the grid is also another point. What is the core definition for energy transition in your view?
Well, I think by definition, it is a very broad term. I like to think of the energy transition as all the parallel transitions that are going on. So specifically the decarbonization of the electricity system and the progressive replacement of fossil fuels with clean electricity in the end-use sectors. That, for me, is the energy transition.
Okay, so greening. What is the place of electrification in this respect?
So electrification is essentially about removing fossil fuels wherever possible and replacing it with electricity, and that's in particular the case in transport, in buildings, and in industry. And if we look towards the end goal, we are talking about ballpark figures of anywhere between 55 and 65% of all energy use in society coming from electricity.
Okay, for electric, the grids are at the center, at least this month. And this is also the case in Romania, of course. Is there any clear pathway that each country might take in order to advance in electrification in society, or will have different approaches in each country?
I think the virtue of the EU, Europe, is to, on the one hand, steer things with very clear strategic guidance. On the other hand, leave it to the countries to do it in the way that is actually practically possible for them. In particular, if we look in the generation space, there's a lot of legacy decisions that decide how a country can transition. And if the Commission resorts too much to micromanagement, you're going to get a lot of unnecessary conflicts, essentially. One of the most obvious ones is about nuclear, where there's been a feeling on the part of the countries that have a lot of nuclear in the mix that this was not allowed. And to be fair, it wasn't just a feeling. There was also some legislation really pushing nuclear out.
Very powerful shareholders pushing against.
Yeah, and what that does is that instead of focusing on the objective together to actually fix the climate challenge, we are bogged down in discussions about whether it needs to be the one or the other low carbon fuel source that basically powers our transition there. And you know what? In this particular moment in time, completely regardless from the substance of that discussion, the geopolitical implications of having such an unnecessary fight are very serious. Putin will be rubbing his hands in the Kremlin to see Macron and the German Chancellor have a ruckus over this, and in the same way across the Atlantic, they'll be like, okay, those guys are just not getting it together. They're fighting over unnecessary details instead of focusing on what's really important.
In Romania, it was very clear for many years already that if we are serious about decarbonization, nuclear energy is a must-have, and we pushed for that in European bodies. Tell me, I heard you talking about the European toolbox that each country might take into consideration recently at Power Play organized by Eurelectric. Please present 2, maybe 3 items in that toolbox that you might that you think that might be very useful.
Well, this toolbox has grown immensely over the years. So which ones would be the ones to highlight? Let me take it in 2 chunks here. We have a massive body of legislation that we have negotiated over the last few years under the heading of the Green Deal. A market design that was already, let's say, put in place with the clean energy package, electrification policies across the end-use sectors, a phase out of sales of new combustion engines by 2035, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that should be left to implementation now. We need to go and do that stuff, transform the words into action, and make realities out of all those legal texts. If we look at the new stuff that's on the table now, in terms of the toolbox, I think what's going to be really, really interesting is to see how those new elements of the Clean Industrial Deal will help member states actually make things happen on the ground. There is this so-called decarbonization bank as part of the Clean Industrial Deal, which aims at raising some 100 billion euros for transformation of industries. I think this is really, really interesting, and I'm hopeful that this can make a change on the ground. By the way, I think that Romania is a good example of the EU really adding value in some cases. I think the figure is around 14 billion euros that Romania has received in different types of grants and support programs. And that's real money that flows into the economy. And I can say, as someone who only comes here, every 2-3 years, every time I come, I'm impressed by how the country is evolving. When you're here every day, probably you're like, okay, well, the politicians are useless. We have loads of problems. When I come here, I'm like, wow, things seem to have been renovated since I came last. I see lots of progress on the energy transition, lots of new renewable projects shooting up here and there. The cars are getting new, the fleet is getting renewed. So I think there's a lot of positive things to be said in Romania about Europe and the fact that Romania is an active part of the EU.
Great and fresh perspective on Romania. Thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit more about the money. There is this discussion in Europe and in Romania too about the investment gap in terms of modernizing the grids. And there are some voices talking about the necessity to remove grants and support for generation in renewables, for example, which seems to be self-sustainable, at least a little bit, in order to move the same amount of money, or maybe more, into modernizing grids. At the same time, we are talking about affordability, and any public money invested into the grids will move directly into the bills. How can we solve this conundrum?
Yeah, maybe just a sort of big picture consideration here. The reason why we as an organization and an industry like to have a market approach to things is that if our sector gets more and more bloated by subsidies, that we're sort of, pulling public money into our sector, eventually the customers are going to, or society is going to have to carry that sector, and it's going to be a more and more heavy burden if instead what we produce is actually being paid directly by the people who benefit from it, by the customers. There will be a bigger willingness to pay, and that's why this market-based approach is one that we advance. When it comes to renewables, more and more we see that especially onshore renewables, wind and solar are essentially more and more in the money because the cost of these technologies has come down very substantially, and at the same time, the price of electricity has risen somewhat as a consequence of rising gas prices. So indeed, we are seeing an increasing amount of pace when it comes to renewables. They've been heavily subsidized, and if I now look at where would more stuff need to happen in order for the transition to become successful, it would really be about focusing on the system, focusing on the infrastructure, and focusing on the flexibility piece. And indeed, there's a lot to be said in favor of boosting grid investments. We've made some research, other bodies have made research, and the consensus is that we need a significant ramp up of grid investments in order to keep pace with the other developments in the system. In the same vein, the flexible generation, or the ability of the system to adapt to more variable generation patterns, is something that really needs urgent attention. We have been phasing out progressively the dispatchable units on the system, because in part they were old, in part they were polluting. What that means is that the ability to dispatch the system and provide flexibility and balance has diminished somewhat, and in some regions quite significantly. This is something that needs urgent attention, because if we can't balance the system, we can't provide electricity at will to the customers, and their trust in the plan to electrify the economy will start to fragment, and that would be the worst thing that could possibly happen.
One of the main topics in recent 2 years in Romania was the high prices for imbalances in several periods of each day, in fact. And the other day in our summit, a gentleman from Transelectrica, the local TSO, talked about these prices as a penalizing formula meant to push the private investors to act accordingly in order to reduce their negative impact into the grid. I understand that this is somehow the view that you hold too.
Absolutely. I mean, the logic of the market is that if something becomes scarce, in this case, the ability to balance the system, the price goes up. And this should also definitely be a signal to the investors. The conundrum here is that a lot of the machines that are able to balance the system, they will be the ones that are dispatched last, because we have a marginal pricing logic to the system, which means that the cheapest source gets dispatched first, which is great. Is not so great for the very expensive machine that is critically needed on the grid, that will only run a few hundred hours per year. That machine will not be in the money, and that's one of the investment conundrums we're seeing. Even if we have high balancing costs, we're not seeing sufficient investments in the machines that can actually solve that. And this is where we need actually to deploy that European toolbox you were mentioning.
Oh, okay.
And for instance, capacity mechanisms can play an important role here.
This is also the problem with new technologies like power storage in batteries. And I think that in many countries, in Romania included, some changes in the regulation might be introduced in order to make this investment more reliable.
Indeed. One of the conundrums around the flexibility equation is that we're seeing a massive rise in the interest, and also in part in the investment into battery storage. And that's great. We like that, because it's in principle non-polluting if the electricity you put in there is non-polluting. The challenge with storage is, or with battery storage, is that it mainly covers the daily flexibility needs. We also increasingly have weekly flexibility needs and seasonal flexibility needs. A battery is not going to cover any of that. So we need other types of machinery, other types of kit on the system that can handle these timeframes. And this is where we need to find out, how do we actually address the market in a way where it's
What
efficient.
technologies do you have in mind when you're talking about weekly and seasonal flexibility?
Well, there's different machinery. For instance, pumped hydro can solve for longer time frames typically than a battery. But we also need to be clear about the fact that we need power plants still. We need power plants on the grid for a long time to come in order to solve for those cold doldrums, the Dunkelflaute, as they call it in Germany. We don't have immediate other solutions than power plants that we can deploy here, and we need to be a bit honest about that, because if we pretend that everything is a-okay, and we lure all of society into an electric future without actually being able to serve that need, we're going to have a huge pushback.
Thank you for this very balanced approach. We have a little, just a couple of minutes or two more questions, maybe with shorter answers. One would be the role of digitalization in order to improving and optimizing the functioning of the grid. Is there a real chance that more AI, more digital and automation would make the existing grids better?
Absolutely. I would even say that we'll have no chance of balancing the grid without digital solutions. So we need to make an aggressive all-in push towards more digital solutions. At the same time, we need to be mindful of the challenges and the risks that come along with this, because when we digitize more, we also provide a broader, let's say, a spectrum for attack by cyber crooks, and unfortunately this is the new reality.
And the final perspective, on the side of the consumers, they have a huge role, and in Europe we are talking about active user of the grid, something that is still a dream at the moment, not really effective in Romania at least. Which kind of consumers do you see as most important? The small consumers, households installing their own PV equipments, or maybe the large industrial consumers, because they have scale and they can influence more the general situation?
Yeah, so I would say DSR is a must-have in order for the new system to function, and I would be a little bit more upbeat than you on let's say the involvement of customers in the electricity system, but there's still a long way to go. For the heavy industry, we actually do have them as an active player already. If you're not able to clear the market, typically the system operator would pick up the phone and call the big industrial and say, hey, you need to turn down now. Mm-hmm. So that's happening today. The other two segments that we need to activate more are the sort of Mr. and Mrs. Joneses that will need a smart meter in order to sort of get going, and also need market arrangements, regulatory arrangements around their involvement in turning up and down. More and more we are seeing products coming from the retail space with like sort of when to charge a car. The most downloaded app in Denmark is one that sort of forecasts the day-ahead prices. Mm-hmm. So it's going on in different markets, a little bit depending on the technological maturity. One space I feel that we could do much more is sort of the medium-sized industries where you could actually pool demand much more easily. Think of all those office buildings with a lot of glass and a lot of AC. Think of supermarket chains that have thousands and thousands of freezers that you could freeze just a little bit more, and hence sort of allow also to tow up more if the electricity is expensive. Here's an opportunity to pool demand and feed it into the system and make things much more flexible, and sort of getting that going with those customers would be very interesting.
In Romania, there are some encouraging signs in this segment with office buildings and commercial spaces too. So we'll see. One final request from my side at the moment. Please choose one energy myth that you encounter frequently in Europe and you think that might be useful to address and debunk.
Well, I got to say that, with the blackout in Spain, there was a lot of sort of immediate reverting to this must have been because of renewables. Even before anybody had a technical analysis, a lot of people were jumping on that standard explanation on social media. And I think we need a much more nuanced perspective here, which is renewables are here to stay and more are going to come because we have something called climate change that we need to fix. And by the way, these technologies are way cheaper. So the market is basically pulling these technologies in. Do we have a set of challenges in basically balancing and operating that new system? Yes, but let's tackle them rather than pointing fingers.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristian Ruby, Secretary and General of EOL Electric, for this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, this ends the current edition of What's Next. Thank you for joining us and looking forward for the next meeting.